1 Timothy chapter 4. Now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in later times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. May God bless the reading of His Word. Bible smack. Alright, so today I am responding to a guy named Jordon Karem, who is part of a group called reason2doubt. And he had a debate with Kent Hovind, and it was a Uniformitarian versus flood geology. Now, as I'm watching this video, there's some things I started to notice. And I actually did a video already, and it messed up. So, you know, sometimes you just got to deal with that. But basically, I had wanted to ask some questions about, mental health and issues of that. And one thing that I had started off with, my premise was that there was a lot of fallacies going on that were pretty obvious. They're just very self-evident. And for instance, one of the things was that Jordon talked about how virtually all scientists would agree with the Uniformitarian geology, and that's wrong. It's just not true. There's many I could think of. I mean, we start off with the creation science movement with Dr. Henry Morris, who is a hydrologist, okay? But also, he cites a guy in the debate, John Baumgartner, and deals with his model. And John Baumgartner, is a UCLA guy. And, I mean, just a very high-credentialed scientist. So, he knows that there are scientists who do disagree with Uniformitarian geology. And yet he knowingly just puts it out like everybody believes this. Now, the instincts that I have is to be like, hey, you're making a deception. I'm angry. Okay? And, I think that, you can have that cop mentality of saying you're up to something. Okay? You're purposely trying to deceive. But actually, it could be that there's something going on. There's a mental glitch, okay, for why you are feeling justified with a dishonest argument when you honestly are holding to a position. Why is it that you feel like you have to use something dishonest? And not just dishonest, but it was just patently. It was just that you knew that you were saying this, that it was going to come out of your mouth, and it just, people could catch it. Okay. So, with that, a lot of times when we hit that bump and we're debating worldviews, there's a natural tendency to think, well, you must be crazy, and so atheists in the new atheist movement have constantly throwing that out there. You're crazy. What's wrong with you for believing in this? Okay. But, you have to ask, well, what if we're not the ones who are crazy? What if you're the one who's crazy? Okay. And we don't have to do it in a violent sense of like, well, you're just a nutball. But are there mental processes that are skipping a beat here? Are there things that are kind of warping our understanding? Now, Jordon, I decided to, do a little deeper research after, my first video didn't work. And so I looked up your personal testimony. And it was a experiential becoming an atheist testimony. Now, one thing that I notice when it comes to this stuff is that you have typical church things that I have always been wary of as a minister, and my experience is not the same. Okay. I did not get reared in the church with no alternative. I knew the evolutionary theory to some extent starting at the age of 6 when I got a children's encyclopedia. Okay. So I had kind of developed that, and I was, kind of in some sort of quasi-deistic period first, and then, trying to figure out, like, maybe there's creation and there's evolution, and, not really, you're absorbing things as a child, and then, you start to deal with critical thought maybe around the middle school period. And then, you start having to deal with reality and what you want to do with your life in high school. And then you have that college reevaluation period. Now, when it comes to your background, I noticed a couple things. And the first was what you admitted in the debate, and that was dealing with you had military service, and I give blood, and I noticed that there's a lot of like medical things that like going through these medical questionnaires, and they keep on asking, have you been overseas? You did service, you're this, you're military, and that kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of things that you have to ask as far as like have I had this traumatic experience? Well, you said that while you were away in the military, then you went through a divorce. Now, I do believe that a divorce is mentally traumatic. Okay, I had gone through a divorce myself, and as a Christian, you believe this is, impossible. We always joke there may be a funeral, but there's going to be no divorce. And then all of a sudden, it happens. Now, yours was you're leaving that person. Mine was they're leaving me. Go figure. But basically, I understand a little bit what you're talking about, but also the way that you explain it in the way that I see my experience. You said, well, I didn't change from being divorced. Okay. And yes, I didn't change my faith from being divorced either. Okay. But basically, the effects are not instantaneous. Okay. There's a real damage and a shaking of everything you feel and experience and believe when you hit that trauma, especially if you've kind of gone out and you've served your country and stuff. There's a variety of different things, but I noticed that it's kind of ironic because historically our soldiers, they always had that motto, there's no atheists with foxholes, and the majority would be turning to God. But, I'm seeing a lot of people, I don't know any statistics, but I'm seeing a lot who are getting away from God, okay, with their experiences. And so, dealing with a lot of various types of traumas, even if you're not going through it yourself, maybe you got lucky, okay, you're still watching others, you know what I'm saying? And so, and you're dealing with others who, like, they come back, and then they're dealing with, people are committing suicide when they get home, post-traumatic stress, all that kind of stuff. And I've seen that. I've seen guys who, like, I was going to church with a guy who was serving several tours of duty, and he's like sitting there at church, and he's like super soldier, just kind of staring, and he's got his kid, and the kid's crying, and he's just not moving, and he's just straightforward. This is what we do, and just super soldier. And he gets home, a couple years go by, and he just falls apart. Okay, gains about 50 pounds. He had a six-pack. Okay, I mean, he was just, and that's, it's like, it just total collapse. Okay. And so when you have these traumatic experiences, as I said, you've got the Army mixed in with that. And you also have a lot of various forms of indoctrination that you're battling over. I think that when you talk about a deconversion experience, especially since you're going into atheism, so you're not like seeking, at least you're not seeking a spiritual experience. Okay, so when you're going through that experience, it is natural to want to finally have this relief when you develop your own ideas. And if you are raised in church, then you have a worldview that is placed upon you by tradition. Okay? And so you're going into different worlds, and you feel exiled from the Christian world because you went through a divorce. Okay? And these things, divorce is like a tearing apart of your life. Okay? Even if you're the one leaving, they're going to keep something there. Okay? And so basically, as you go through these experiences and go through these traumas, it is natural to want to liberate yourself from that as you're condemned in the one worldview and accepted in the other. Okay? So, and you explained that you know that there's some weirdness that was going on. You had a memory that was fabricated in your head, and this kind of refers to that shock and trauma. Now, I don't want to say this to make this the issue. Okay, I'm not trying to do that, and I apologize if that's what starts out sounding like. But I'm doing that because I am seeing these trends and what people go through, and I have a guy who, you have your sometimes you have a Facebook friend, so you don't know them in real life, but you interact with them so much on the internet that they become like they're there, but there's always a little something missing. But basically, me and him, we did some shows together on the internet, and then I had long conversations and phone messages and stuff like that. So over the years, very close to me. But basically, he went through a deconversion atheist experience, and kind of things popped back into place for him later on in life. And it had to deal with the fact that he was a family man, just the way of the hubris of the humanist world, and also what he's seeing, as someone who's politically active, what he's seeing is happening to society and how it's tearing at the fabric of things, and him starting to realize that the one nation under God is the only thing that's politically holding society together, and that society falls apart, and this is what we're seeing. Okay, so your political correctness, the Me Too generation, the racialism, all these different types of left-wing wars, okay, are all being launched, and the chaos is springing because you don't have the one nation under God anymore. So there's no binding force. Okay, so society is not bound together. There is no allegiance, and they start feasting upon each other. And so that's what, when he had a horrible experience, and, I think God really gave it to him, but basically, when he had a horrible experience, it made him kind of, stop and kind of realize some things. So he had trauma to kind of get him out, and then there's trauma to get him back in. But basically, there is a lot of similarity. I see that when you're kind of talking about, well, I kind of got away from that, and I got away from that, and I got away from that, and boom, okay. But there is an issue of will. Okay, so basically, your will can guide you to things. Now, when you talk about the atheism and saying this is true, that's why I feel like I've got a hunch here. Okay, because atheism cannot give you truth. Atheism cannot give you science. Where do the laws of science come from? Well, we make laws of science based on our observations, and the observations we pick to be our observations. Okay? And so we say gravity's always worked, and if gravity does not work, we have an excuse. Okay? So basically we say this is what we've observed, but even if it's exactly what we've observed, and we've always been honest about it, and this is what we've always seen, we can't guarantee from what we've always seen that that's really what's going on. Okay? So, like, why is it that every atom has these various chemical properties? Why is it that things stay in place and we know it's going to keep having those chemical properties? Why do I know that this behind me is going to be yellow? Or is it really yellow, or is it just the engineering of our eyes? In reality, it's not really that color at all. It's just our perception of the color. Could be an illusion. Okay. When we think about, these issues, and I'm talking about the mental health, how do you know that there's not something off in your interpretive process or in your mental process of what's going on? Even if you can get a population to agree with you, maybe that population is, going down their own rabbit hole. Okay? So when we see Hindus in India back in the 1700s, they would go and throw their babies to the alligators. At some point, everybody in that society lived in that worldview, and they said, this is what we do. Okay, and then finally there was a Christian worldview, and they said, no, we can't have that. And they argued, hey, this is wrong. So they found reasons to kind of come up with that. But there is like a morality, okay? And I do think that you believe in a morality, but we have to say, is morality just mental processes? And when we do mental processes, is it really something that's materialistically evolutionary based? Because if it's evolutionary based, then it's everything that I'm sensing with my physical senses is how do I determine reality? How do you look at a jungle and come up with calculus? Okay? And if you can't come up with calculus, then how can you develop the software that, you're watching me on the internet do? If you're watching me. But I'll send this to them. But basically, if this happens, these are things that are not material. Okay? And when we map the brain, what we find, like let's say in your eye sockets, there's a thing called the connecting problem. I think there's a guy named Jerome Felding or something that deals with that. But there's a thing called the connecting problem where you got these cords in your eyes and these nerve sockets are all picking up the information of movement and color and shape. And basically all the information is going back into some sort of nut. Okay, this nut-sized part of your brain, and it's disappearing. And then it's thought about, and then it comes reproduced and regurgitated right back out. But you're not finding any physical mechanism. You just see it all disappear as they've mapped the brain. You see it all disappear, and then it just reappears back out. And so there's a lot of stuff when it comes to brain activity, and also studies in near-death experiences, where there is mental processes going on, but they're not going on from the brain. So, anyhow, there are, reasonings and stuff like that and presuppositions that are going on in before we get to that uniformitarian debate. And so I'm glad I looked at your stuff later to kind of see some of my suspicions affirmed about that. Now, when it comes to, that shift, there is a faith shift going on in your testimony. And basically, you're saying, well, the reasons are going here, and it all explains everything. And I'm not saying this explains everything, and so that's where we can kind of start touching on the debate. So one thing is that when we deal with science and facts and things like that, we have to know epistemology. We have to know what we can know and what we don't know. Okay? And so when we're dealing with origins, what are we dealing with? Well, we deal with a subject they call historical science. Now, historical science is not experimental science. Basically, when you do experiments, we can take our findings and keep our data, and we have data of modern technology going back to about 200 years of experience. And then we can have more primitive versions of experiments going back another 200 years back to Newton. But we don't have experiments going on in the ancient past. And the level that we're talking about, we have historical observations in the past. But the ancient past only goes back, on a strict form with genealogies, it only goes back about 5,000 years. And you can extrapolate a little further and go into archaeological theory, and then you're dealing with like maybe 20,000 years. Meanwhile, your anthropologist has to stretch it out even further to kind of conform to evolution. And so they want to go back 200,000 years. But then we don't have records of people farming, for instance, past those early 1,000 years. And we don't have a mechanism for them to start farming. So what was it that the hominids were doing for over 100,000 years? Year in and year out, not figuring this stuff out, not figuring out, hey, this seed gets planted. And you got, 80 years to kind of look at this stuff, and you ain't got TV. Okay, but they still can't figure it out. And yet, at the same time, when we look at these ancient people, they did have ingenious abilities. You look at Babylonian and Egyptian records of mathematics, and you will find them having a mathematical intelligence far beyond what today's school systems could even work with. Heck, even Abe Lincoln was dealing with addition and multiplication with numbers way beyond what kids deal with. So, and not only that, but you have linguistic sciences too. So, you had geniuses back then. And yet, still, with all their intelligence to know 5 or 6 different languages, they couldn't figure out how to plant a seed and reap a crop. Okay. All right. So basically, with that, we leave the world of observation. When we leave the world of observation, we have then committed a fallacy, a logical fallacy of induction. If I had a swimming pool and I filled it up with marbles, and I took a scooper and scooped out 9 red marbles and 1 blue marble, does that mean the pool is 90% red marbles? No, I cannot judge the population by the sample. That is the inductive fallacy. So when we look at the ancient past, we make these calculations. And how much more is 1,000,000 than 5,000? It's about 200 times more. Let's see here. 5, 10, and 10, so that's 100, yeah. So, just to get 1,000,000 years, you have a leap of faith of 200 times what your facts are. But then we're not dealing with 1,000,000. Now we're dealing with 4.6 billion. Okay. Not to mention, they may say 13.8, but Oops, they went back. They went backwards recently. they went from 13.8 and then they went backwards to, what was it, 11.2 billion years before the Big Bang, because they got one of their calculations wrong. Okay. So basically, we have to be careful about what we're certain of. Now, when we look at geology, we have the geologic column that was made by Lyell. And in your debate, you said, well, so what? I'm not reading Lyell. I'm reading all these guys 200 years later. Okay. But the scientists are running with a philosophy. Okay. And that philosophy is developed in the uniformitarian theory developed by Lyell. In your debate with Kent Hovind, there were times where you're like, okay, I'm not a geologist. I don't know what this stuff is. Okay, well, at that point, what are you doing? You are saying, I'm going to go to faith. Okay, so when you're presupposing your model, presuppositionalism is really just faith. Okay, so when you're presupposing your model, you're really putting faith in your model. All right, and so you're not dealing with facts. Now, you said multiple times. Okay, so this is where, see, I forgot the phrase because I'm going off of memory here. But basically, this is a point where you're not really matching this up in your head, because you're saying that, like, if I see new evidence, then I can switch what I believe, but you can't, because you're still saying, okay, no, I have faith in the system. No, I have faith in the system. So when do you stop having faith in the system? When you stop feeling like having faith in the system. All right? So you're not really going strictly by facts. Nor really can you. Okay? So we go to this geologic column. Now, the original geologic column that Lyell was presenting was about 100 miles deep. And it was to represent 1,000,000 years. But now we need to represent 4.6. How do we get those numbers? Now, I know how we get those numbers, and we'll talk about that in a second. But when we're dealing with that geologic column, we don't find the geologic column anywhere on the Earth. At least not as Lyell proposed it. They talk about, and from what I've seen, there's 2 locations, China and North Dakota, and these have the layers in the right order. Okay, but they're not 100 miles deep. Okay. And then there's about 20 locations where you can get about 3 or 4 of the layers in order out of 15. And then every other location on God's green earth that was ever dug is going in chaos. Okay. You should have more order if the whole world was made that way. Okay. And you also have to understand that history is going to tell you not only, what happened, but also how the process worked. So when we look at Lyell and uniformitarianism, what you see is that he didn't really have a lot of evidence. He had anecdotal evidence. And you were dealing with the anecdotal evidence when it was talking about polystrate fossils. So you have these trees and you have the multiple layers that the tree is going through. But you have trees that are just upside down and the same layers are going through them. Well, this is anecdotal, but it's anecdotal both ways. Okay? And the problem is that historically, this was used for that system. Now, that system imposed itself. That system helped it to get government grants. So that not just America, but the entire Western world, heck, the whole world, because you got to think of the Chinese communists, Asia, and all that kind of stuff. All right, all these systems forcing, by the power of government, forcing this to be the worldview. Okay, so you have a worldview that's being taught, that's being imposed, and that's being funded. Okay, on a massive scale. And when it's being funded on that massive scale, then people can say, look, this is the way people had it, and I can trust all these people. What is that? It's a bandwagon fallacy. You're not really going through the science, you're just trusting in people. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm sure that you've done some science, but you have to stand on the shoulders of giants. You actually used that phrase. I don't know where you got the phrase, but you did. You used that phrase, so we stand on the shoulders of giants. One of them was the one they were talking about, Lyle. Okay. So basically, by standing on the shoulders of giants, you're once again going into faith mode. Okay. You're not going by the evidence. Now, when we have that mixed up geological column, what happens? Well, when we look at our carbon dating, when we look at our radiometric dating, isochron, whatever, what we're tending to do is we tend to try to link it back to the geologic column. Okay? So once you try to link it back to this geologic column, then you're still under that system. Now, the radiometric dating that you get from things like uranium, as you talked about, there's a couple presuppositions there. One, I believe that there's a presupposition because it was based on an asteroid instead of what was actually buried underneath the Earth. And I think that's where the starting point was there. Okay, but basically, as they go about with that starting point, there's an assumption of the parent and daughter element. You say, well, the parent element, the heavier element, starts and then this one finishes. Well, we can see a natural process, okay, that there is electrons leaking and stuff like that. And so the uranium eventually boils down to your lead, okay. But just like if I was to go in the kitchen, and you go in the kitchen and we see a bucket, and there's a faucet that's dripping, we don't know if, we might think, okay, well, now I can measure the amount of water in there to know how long it's been dripping. But we don't know if somebody came in before us and turned the water all the way on and then turned it back to that drip. Okay? This is where that inductive fallacy comes back in. And my solution in my theory would be what was called, I call my theory the fall of Lucifer. It's within a grander cosmology theory that I call Years Cosmology. But basically, the Earth got shaped by a gamma ray burster. In my theory, the universe is connected with ether and electric force over and above the gravity forces. And so basically, there is a catastrophe that ignites it. And so if you go and look at Polaris is actually a combination of 3 to 6 stars, depending on what you're measuring. And there is a little dwarf neutron star. And basically, this thing shoots off a gamma ray burster. And that gamma ray burster has enough energy for an entire star in and of itself. And it strikes upon the Earth, conducted through the magnetic North Pole. And in the magnetic North Pole, there's huge deposits of iron, so it hits and connects. And the ancient Earth, going back in creationism, is an ice canopy with miles of, about 10 miles deep, you find reservoirs of subterranean water. And the subterranean water itself is highly pressurized. It's kind of radioactive by nature. And so that boils down and heats up the water and explodes. And the explosion, I believe, starts where modern-day Iceland is. So it comes out of Iceland, and then it creates this, what we call the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Now, by the way, in your debate, you mentioned John Baumgartner, and you start talking about your problems with the flood, but you're using it on catastrophic plate tectonics. You claim to be a creationist under Kent Hovind. But if you're really studying Kent Hovind, okay, as opposed to, well, yeah, they may watch the video, we played it, but I don't really care. I was trying to get in and out. Oh, Mom, why are you homeschooling me? Okay. But if you're a really student, then you know that he goes by more of the hydroplate theory. His theory is his own. He calls it the hovind theory, but it's mostly the hydroplate theory with a small ice canopy. My model has a large ice canopy with lots of water in it. Why? Because this would make the when this ice canopy gets shattered, okay, this would make an ice age, and it would form the Arctic and the Antarctic, okay. So, and also, why is all that stuff being able to be held? Well, when you relieve all that mass from the Earth has less mass on it. So when the Earth has less mass on it, then you have lighter gravity. The air is compacted, and so you have more buoyancy, which makes it have lesser gravity, which explains, for instance, why it is that pterodactyls physically could not fly today, but they could in this ancient antediluvian world. Nevertheless, so there's a mid-Atlantic ridge that explodes that separates the North and South American continents from Africa and Europe, and then it explodes further into the Mediterranean, okay, and then out Arabia. Well, that ridge, okay, with that explosion, boils a huge amount of water in this explosion, okay. And we see some of the remnants of the explosion in chalk beds. Okay, all this mass of microbiology that just gets instantly killed in nuclear pressure and shot out. Okay, creating these chalk beds that you see along Nova Scotia and Britain and stuff. Okay, a couple other places. But yeah, you see that explosion go on, and it goes to the Mediterranean, boiling huge amounts of water, which boiling huge amounts of the ocean water, what? Leaves a lot of salt. And that's the salt beds that you talked about in the debate. So then it goes through and it does that, and it kicks up a whole lot of sandstone, destroying it and stuff. And so all that sand goes over and creates the Sahara Desert. Okay. On the opposite end, we got North America shoving over here. You got dirt kicked up, creating the Smoky Mountain. You got dirt shoved over on the other side, okay, that's kicked up, and that creates the Rocky Mountains, and it creates the Andes. And all this water shooting out has to go out from somewhere. So the Pacific plate had subterranean waters underneath it that are now sunk. Okay, all that water shoots out, okay, and it sinks. We've got these underwater islands in the Pacific. So that it's like flat and eroded from the wind, and yet it's hundreds of feet under the water. So the Pacific plate shrinks. It tips it up. North America shoves it over. As it shoves it over, that creates a great trench. Okay, so in Asia, you have these huge underwater trenches, and that creates a lot of pressure, which causes the ring of fire, all those volcanoes popping up in the ring of fire because of all that tension. And in both ways, but not as many volcanoes on the American side as on the Asian side. Okay, and then all that pressure shooting down again rises up the dirt, and so what do you have? You have the Himalayas. Okay, so that's just some of the stuff explained in my theory, and I'll post a link to it when I post this video. But basically, so there is other theories to it. When we get to those, the dating, the radiometric process. Now, the uranium has a special date on it, but you already probably know this because you mentioned the rate process, okay, or the rate project. And so you already know about how there's a helium that is dissipates out from the uranium, and that you can measure the amount of helium that is dissipated out of the uranium, and then it only equates about 5,000 years. But there is another thing that we don't like to mention that much anymore, but there's also another process that has been going on. In the Earth, there is huge amounts of primordial ancient Earth that we call granite. And in that granite, and this is something you should already be well read on, but then again, you were kind of off on a couple facts, trying to argue that catastrophic plate tectonics to a hydroplate theorist, okay? Not really knowing all the deep creation science, okay? So I'm sorry, you weren't getting your A plus on that. You're getting more of a D plus, maybe. Anyhow, we have polonium halos that are found in granite. And it's been collected in different places throughout the world. Robert Gentry, the physicist, found it did about a dozen peer-reviewed essays back in the 70s and 80s until it got blacklisted. But they're there, and they're subject to peer review, and they were subjected to peer review, and they passed. And basically, the polonium halo, this radiation that comes out of polonium, to make these halos, it only takes a minute or two. But the granite itself, we don't know how granite's formed. And the assumption is, according to this process, that we're supposed to assume that this takes a billion, maybe a couple billion years of this hot earth to turn into granite. So this hot lava earth is supposed to do that over a billion years. But it only takes the polonium a couple seconds, just like an Alka-Seltzer tablet, to fizz out and then be done. So if it's lava, then there would be no trace of polonium halos. Only takes about a minute or two to make them. Okay, it couldn't just sit there and wait a billion years and not fizz out. Okay. We also have a lot of evidence for subterranean waters, but I'll just point you to stuff on the previous videos that I've made about that subject. Well, anyhow, we have to, we have to look at these different things as far as the factors of what's going into these models. Once again, you didn't answer this one. Ken Hovind kept on bringing up how you got different limestones, okay? And there's supposed to be two different layers, but the only reason they're different is because you have different fossils. And we know that the paleontology is based on the evolutionary theory, and then they say, okay, well, that's going to date the geologic column, and then when we use the geologic column, we date the fossils. The fossils date the column dates the fossils. That's circular logic. Okay. So we don't have the column. So it doesn't matter, well, this one's high up here and that one's low down there. They're not high or low. And you know that. Because if you dig, that fossil might not be that high at all. When we talk about the pterodactyl, you said, well, they're in these low categories. They're not in the high places. Well, in Central America, they've got caves that they've found where they have paintings to these pterodactyls that they would think of them as dragons. But they look just like pterodactyls, and then, we found the fossils right there. And there's a lot of these connections between legends of dragons, okay, and pictures of dragons, and historical records that have tales of dragons that look just like dinosaurs. And the ancient people didn't have the word dinosaur. We know that's only a term that's 150 years old. China has many legends of pterodactyl-looking creatures within 500 years. So we have a lot of this stuff down there, but basically as we look at this stuff, I don't find the uniformitarian theory to be a valid hypothesis. And I think that there is a faith being imposed in this system. Okay? And so when you have a faith being imposed, you have to answer, like, what is that faith and why is that faith? Because then you're going to have to start asking yourself questions of, like, how do I know that my mental process is correct and that my mental process is knowing what's good and bad? Because if good and bad is something other than it, if it is a mental process, it's really subjective. But if it's not a mental process, then it has to be something spiritual. Okay? And so then there is a spiritual good to be longing forward to and looking forward to. So I don't mind if we interact, and if you want to do a debate on the subject, or if you want to just talk about the subject, that'd be cool. But we'll catch you later here on Bible Smack.